Okay, so hello there. Thank you very much for tuning in today. My name is Codie Croasdale. I'm a tenancy lawyer at Marrickville Legal Centre. My role is to help people, perhaps like yourself, navigate difficult situations with their housing. And today we'll be talking about what's possibly one of the toughest problems a tenant can encounter while renting. What are we meant to do when we can't afford to pay our rent? So there's no real simple answer to this question, and for the next half hour, we'll be dedicated to exploring a few different options. Well, I hope this is helpful to you. I must note that all information provided today is exactly that. This is not a substitute for legal advice. And if what I speak about today resonates with you or someone you know, I do encourage you to get in contact with us or your local tenancy advisory service and get some advice. Now, today is going to be recorded. If you have any questions, you're very welcome to put them in the chat. And before we get into it, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and the many diverse lands that we're tuning in from. Today, I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country, and this land holds structures of law that has been practiced for thousands of generations. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, let's get into it and talk about rent. Starting with some basics. New South Wales residential tenancy agreements are contracts made between a tenant, that's the person renting a property, and the landlord, the person who owns the property. They're all made under the Residential Tenancies Act, and you can tell whether you are subject to the Residential Tenancies Act often by looking at the agreement. You'll see on the slide there is a standard form residential tenancy agreement. That is the usual format that tenancy agreements will be in. If you don't have one of those, it's probably best to get in contact with us. We'd be happy to have a chat with you, or likewise your local tenancy advisory service, and work out what kind of agreement you do have. Now, during this talk, I'll be talking or referring to your landlord a lot. Sometimes a landlord will hire a real estate agent to manage their property for them. While the real estate agent is not your landlord, they can be taken as a representative of your landlord and probably the best person for you to contact about your rental issues. Okay, so the Act does provide a number of rights and obligations on tenants. And for the purposes of this talk, I guess the most pressing one is the obligation to pay your rent, the agreed rent, in full, a maximum of 14 days in advance. It's important that wherever possible, tenants do adhere to this obligation. If you do fall more than 14 days behind in your rent, the landlord can take action to terminate your tenancy agreement. And any rent you don't pay now may very well result in a debt to the landlord, which could come back and haunt you later. So now that's out of the way. What are we actually meant to do if we can't afford to pay? There are 3 steps that I encourage all tenants to take as soon as possible. I guess the first one that I might mention for now is to seek financial counselling. Now, there are a wide range of different free financial counsellors out there. The easiest way to find them is often by calling the National Debt Helpline. I've provided the number on the screen, but it is 1800 007 007. Then they can also offer advice on their online chat on their website. The reason I do recommend getting in contact with a financial counsellor is because they're not only able to provide you with financial advice and help you plan out a structure or a budget, but they can also help you potentially get some evidence of your finances together. If you're struggling to make ends meet, I do also suggest reaching out to local services and seeing how they might be able to support you. There's a really wide range of different services out there, and a great starting point is to have a look at a website, perhaps like Ask Izzy. So it's askizzy.org.au. That provides a directory of different services in your area. For example, places you can go to help with groceries, food, accommodation, that kind of a thing. And also your local community centre often will know different organisations that might be able to help as well. So I do suggest getting in contact with them. Now, those are two steps. The most important one that I'd like to touch on today, at least for the purposes of paying your rent, is actually getting in contact with the landlord. Do so in writing and do it as soon as possible. Let them know about your situation, see if they agree to a rent reduction. Unfortunately, there's nothing under the law that says that a landlord has to agree to a rent reduction due to financial hardship at least. So the best bet here is to appeal to their humanity, demonstrate why it's in their interests to keep you on as a tenant, and also, if you feel comfortable doing so, explain your vulnerabilities. Talk about, why you're unable to afford to pay. For example, and this is especially important if you are impacted by COVID-19, let them know that, provide evidence of that. If you have a disability, a health condition, support children, have a family member that you care for, anything like that, I'd also suggest just pointing that out to them as well. These things can be very difficult sometimes, and I do think that human to human, it's good to reach out, touch base, and make sure you do it in writing. Make sure whatever you write, you're comfortable with the potential of a third party reading that later. Now, for COVID impacted tenants, and I mentioned that a bit more briefly earlier, but COVID impacted tenants do have some financial incentives that I encourage you to learn about and put in that email as well. Now, I'll be touching on that a bit more later, but first I just want to talk about the negotiations a bit more. So I said this before, I'll say it again, and I will continue to say it throughout this, but get any agreement you make in writing. It's really, really important. Now, if your landlord is on the same page about, or is open to providing you with a rent reduction, it's really important that you're both on the same page about what that means. What a rent reduction means to one person may not necessarily mean the same to another person. So any agreement you make sure it's in writing, make sure it provides a start date and end date if applicable, and clearly sets out the amount of rent that you're required to pay. Now, I also want you to be really mindful about the difference between a waiver and deferral, because unfortunately that does catch people out quite a bit. A waiver is basically where a landlord agrees to reduce the rent and you don't need to pay it back later. So they're waiving the rent. A deferral means that you still owe the rent and you do need to pay it back later. It's just usually at a agreed date. Now, be mindful, these are different kinds of arrangements. Don't let any ambiguity enter the situation. Make sure it's clear whether it is a deferral or a waiver. And if the landlord, again, to stress, the landlord's not obliged to give you a rent reduction, but if they are resisting and you do think that this is something that you want to really try and work on with them, I do encourage you to apply to fair trading. There's a dispute resolution service that you can apply for free, and I'll mention that a few times throughout this presentation as well. So now, as I mentioned, there is an incentive available for landlords who do waive your rent if you are impacted by COVID-19. I will now go to talking about what that actually means. So what is a COVID impacted tenant? And before I do that, here's a sample rent variation agreement it's designed for tenants who are impacted by COVID-19, but you can see here it very clearly says where there is a deferral, where there is a waiver, the amount of rent and how often that would be. So this is try and structure any agreement you have on this as much as you can. Now, COVID impacted tenants. You may be a COVID impacted tenant if you're a tenant in a household, and because of the COVID-19 pandemic, one or more people in that household has either lost employment or income, had a reduction in work hours or income, had to stop working or reduce their work hours because of illness with COVID-19, or if you've had to care for a person with COVID-19. Now, because of one of those factors, and there's a few of them, but because of one of them, the weekly household income has to be reduced by at least 25% of the weekly household income compared with the 4 weeks from the 29th of May. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, but just to be clear, basically, if you have had at least 25% loss of your income or other employment because of one of the reasons I've just mentioned, you may be considered a COVID impacted tenant, and the relevant period is from the 29th of May, the 4 weeks from the 29th of May. So there has been a moratorium on evictions, meaning the landlords have been prevented from evicting tenants for rental arrears accrued when you're a COVID impacted tenant from the 14th of July to the 11th of November. Now, it is the 9th of November. The 11th of November is fast coming up. And unfortunately, what that basically means is that those protections are coming to an end. And I also just want to clarify as well that you are only protected from eviction if you have been paying at least 25% of rent throughout that time. So if you've provided evidence of COVID-19 impacted status and you've paid at least 25% of your rent and you are in arrears from the period of the 14th of July to the 11th of November, do get in contact with us. There may still be protections available to you. It is quite specific advice, so I'm not going to go into it too much today. But I do suggest getting in contact, get some tenancy advice or some legal advice, because those protections could potentially still apply. And I'd like to make sure that you're connected to the right people. Now, that aside, rent reductions. So if you are a COVID impacted tenant, you may be eligible for the residential tenancy support package. Now, this has been available for a while, and it's mostly been available to applications from landlords, but from the 11th of November, coinciding with the end of the moratorium period, COVID-19 impacted tenants whose weekly household income has reduced by at least 25% will be able to apply. So that basically means up to $4,500 worth of rent relief to help you clear your arrears, but you don't necessarily have to have arrears to apply. So if your landlord has previously applied for some but not all of the amount, I'd still encourage tenants to apply. You do need to have consent from the landlord. You need all tenants on the tenancy agreement to sign up, and basically need to have a copy of the tenancy agreement on hand as well to provide fair trading. So there are a few hoops to jump through, not loopholes. There are a few hoops to jump through there, but I mentioned it before, I'd say it again. If the landlord is providing or refusing to provide consent, again, that fair trading mediation is really, really important. They can't compel your landlord to do anything, but they can certainly help show the benefit of, agreeing to a rent reduction or agreeing to sign up for the residential tenancy support package and help with that kind of discussion. So certainly do suggest that. Now, moving on, if you're not COVID impacted, but you are in arrears, the Tenancy Assistance Program, which is a DCJ, Department of Communities and Justice initiated program, is something that could potentially be available to you. So this is basically a one-off payment to help clients who've fallen into arrears sustain their tenancy with helping with either rent or water bills. The maximum amount of assistance is limited to the equivalent of 4 weeks rent, and you can only apply once in that 12-month period. Now, to be eligible, you can't have any more than $1,000 in cash assets. You have to be able to show proof of arrears. You have to have an agreement with the landlord that you can stay in the premise for at least 12 months. And you also have to show that you do otherwise have a sustainable tenancy. So, for example, that your income is enough to meet future payments, which isn't always easy, but just be aware that programs like this do exist, and this is not a loan, so it doesn't need to be repaid. You can apply. I suggest visiting your housing website to get a copy of the application form. Otherwise, you can drop into the housing offices depending on when they're visiting people, and see if you can have a chat to someone there. Okay. I'll be talking about housing a bit more as well in the very near future. So moving on from that for now. So tried to get a rent reduction. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't work. And if you've just tuned in, I've been talking about getting or trying to negotiate rent reductions with your landlord. And I've also been talking about tenants' obligation to pay rent and what it means for COVID-19 impacted tenants. I'm going to now move to talking about what's probably the worst case scenario, but also, unfortunately, a realistic option, something that tenants will possibly need to consider, probably need to consider if the rent is going to be unsustainable for a longer period of time and they're not having any income coming through, and that's leaving your tenancy. Now, it does depend on what kind of agreement you have. So, for example, if you're on a periodic tenancy or periodic agreement, I should say, that might be known as a rolling lease, basically an agreement where you have been part of a fixed term or have had a fixed term. That fixed term has ended, and now the lease is just rolling month by month. If you're in one of those agreements, the answer is quite simple. You can terminate with 21 days notice. I do suggest whenever you terminate a tenancy, make sure on the slide you've got a sample notice to terminate agreement there. Try to fill something like that out. Notice to terminate does have very specific requirements, and I strongly suggest wherever possible meeting those requirements. Now, yeah, you can find that form on the Fair Trading website as well. Okay, so 21 days notice if you're on a rolling lease. If you're on a fixed term agreement, meaning an agreement that goes from one period of time to the next, things do get more complicated. You may need to pay a break fee. The amount of the break fee does depend on how long you've been in the premise, but will usually be, I guess, incremental depending on the quarter that you'll be leaving in. So that could be anywhere from 4 weeks rent to 1 week rent. Can't be more than that. If you are facing the prospect of having a fixed term agreement, leaving a fixed term agreement early, I do suggest wherever possible, negotiate with your landlord. Again, do it in writing. I love putting things in writing. It's really important, but negotiate with your landlord in writing. Tell them why you need to break the lease. Try to encourage them. They don't have to waive this break lease fee, but encourage them to do so based off your own circumstances. Again, human to human, landlords are humans, real estate agents are humans as well. And you want to try and appeal to that humanity here. And the other reason why it is so important to try and write those emails, reach out at least initially, and getting any agreement in writing if you're able to, is because there are also options for you to go to the tribunal. Now, I'll move to that now. Hardship grounds. So this is kind of the last resort. I don't encourage people to go through hardship grounds as a first resort for a few reasons. The first one being that it is much better to write that initial email to your landlord asking that they waive the break fee. And secondly, because these things can be quite delayed. Now, basically, the process is as follows. Tribunal will look at the special circumstances of the case to determine whether there has been undue hardship or will be undue hardship by the tenant if the agreement were not terminated. The discretion, or the tribunal has discretion to waive some or all of the break fee. What that means is they won't necessarily waive the entire break fee. They may not even waive the break fee. And basically to make that application, you don't need to serve the notice of termination. You can just apply directly to the tribunal. Now, if you do apply, mark your application as urgent. That's really important. Like I said, these things can drag on for a really long period of time. I do encourage people wherever possible to try and reach an agreement with the landlord, but if you can't, you can use that email as part of your evidence, okay? Other things you might want to keep track of, any medical certificates, financial statements, proof that you're COVID impacted, anything that can show that undue hardship or that you would suffer undue hardship and can, I guess, demonstrate those special circumstances that I was talking about before. The other thing just to keep in mind, you do normally need to apply within 28 days for this provision. If you're outside of that time frame, or even if you're going to go to the tribunal about this anyway, please go get some advice. It's really important. And that would be as well, not just information like I'm providing you with today, but something that's personalized to your own circumstances. Okay, moving on. I do also suggest that people apply for housing. That's especially so, I suggest that people with a low income who are at risk of homelessness consider applying. The wait list is long. You may be able to cut that down a bit if you can show an urgent need. For example, as I mentioned, serious risk of homelessness, threats of violence, or that your current accommodation is unsafe. You should also be prepared to show why you're not able to meet your needs on the private market. So why can't you find a private rental? Now, like I said, the wait lists are long, but there are actually other benefits to applying for housing that isn't necessarily just that main housing waiting list. So, for example, there's the rent choice scheme, and that's available only in selected areas and only for selected people. But if you are a person with a disability or long-term health conditions who's experiencing domestic violence, who's experienced financial shock, if you're a young person or a veteran, the rent choice scheme is set up so people within select areas who meet that kind of criteria are able to find pathways into that. Now, it really does depend. This is very broad information right now because rent choice, depending on your circumstances, has a different eligibility criteria and application process. But what it usually means in practice is that within the first 12 months of receiving that assistance, there is a subsidy that amounts to the difference between the market rent and about 25% of the recipient's income. Now that does include 100% of any Commonwealth rent assistance as well, and you'll get that from Centrelink. This is short to medium term assistance. It's up to 3 years and it will take your name off the housing register, or it may suspend your application from the housing register. And the best kind of, or the best way to access these kind of services is to reach out to your supports, to contact housing, or to actually just make that application for housing anyway. Now, even if you don't make that application to housing, there are other housing assistants that may be able to help. The Rentstart bond loan is an interest-free bond loan that can help tenants pay for up to 100% of their bond. You can apply for this online. You don't need to make a separate application for housing. And yeah, you can find it at the application form on the housing website. You won't receive this money directly. The money will go to the Rental Bond Board. And if you've already lodged your bond at the Rental Bond Board, unfortunately, you won't be eligible for this. Now, as I mentioned, it is interest-free. The amount or the repayments will depend on the length of your term, and that will usually be between 12 and 18 months. And usually you will need to be an Australian citizen or permanent resident, a resident of New South Wales, have less than $5,000 cash, and be approved for private rental property. Another thing to mention about this is that if you are eligible for the Rentstart bond loan, or if you have received it, you may also be eligible for advanced rent. That may also be true if you are moving into an accommodation that isn't where bond loan isn't available. So for example, a boarding house, but I won't talk about that too much. Just be mindful of that. Okay, and now some final thoughts. I've said it before, I've said it again, I'm going to keep saying it. Keep all your correspondence in writing, be reasonable, be polite, pretend that third party is reading. All of this is evidence that could be used later. So yeah, that's especially the case for any agreements you make. Make sure everything is in writing. If you do find yourself in a position where you need to find a new home, the usual standard for rental affordability is about 30% of your current household income. I do suggest keeping that in mind when looking for a new place. You don't want to be facing the same situation as you have. And yeah, just try to keep that at the forefront of your mind. And it's also really important because if your income is more than that, more than 50, if your rental is not affordable, you may be in a situation where housing may not be able to provide you with certain products or certain assistance. So keep that rent affordable, whatever you can do. I also just want to acknowledge that this is a really hard time. This is such a strange time, and so many people are impacted by real serious hardship. If you feel overwhelmed, that's very understandable. I do encourage you to, take small steps, do what you can to, meet the requirements. So breaking it down into small chunks. For example, contacting your landlord, gathering your important documents, two really helpful first steps. I know that this can feel really tough, but taking those first steps and breaking it down into small chunks, so very important. Reaching out to your supports as well. Once you've taken those main first steps, reaching out to your doctor, social worker if you have one, or an organisation that might be able to set you up with a social worker. Reaching out to your local tenancy advisory service, someone like me who'd be very happy to chat with you about this more and see how it does apply to your circumstances. I just can't recommend that highly enough. Small steps are better than no steps. Okay. I also suggest if you do need someone to chat to, Beyond Blue and Lifeline are two great organisations. They provide telephone counselling and support 24/7. And Tenants Union website does have some great resources and is the best place to find your local tenancy advisory service. And finally, I guess if you are in a situation that is quite dire, I do suggest, where possible, reaching out to the housing Link to Home. Link to Home is a 24/7 hotline. It's available at 1-800-152-152. They can provide you with information and referrals that might be able to set you up with some temporary accommodation. So very important. And with all that in mind, I'll be wrapping up unless anyone has any questions, which you're very welcome to put in the chat now. Okay. Look, I'll be wrapping up then, and thank you very much for tuning in today. I wish you all the very best, and I hope that at least this has provided you with some helpful information on your options moving forward. Thank you.